Hello, my name's Jim Ianelli. I'm the chair of the SWIFMO Scientific Committee, and I'm presenting this last year's Scientific Committee meeting, which was meant to be held in New Zealand, where these beautiful pictures are from, but instead we saw beautiful pictures of each other from faraway places. We did have 140 participants from 14 different countries, and it was spanning across many time zones. And certainly appreciate all the efforts from all of the participants. And just to say that up front. The outline and agenda is listed here. I'll start with some of the administrative arrangements. As I mentioned, due to COVID, we had several meetings leading up to the actual commission scientific committee meeting. The first one began in May to deal with time zones, and we settled on fixed slots. And here's down below is a list of kind of how the slots laid out and how we would focus on them. In each of these, I should say, we rotated through and summarized the emphasis to the subsequent meeting. And I also want to thank, and especially the secretary, for being very diligent. They put together reports from each of these 7 web meetings that we held leading up to that. Those are all available online. There's some 23 documents on this page. And right before the scientific committee, we had a 4-session Deepwater workshop to help with some of the more difficult issues that we were faced with at this meeting. Creative side of things, there were over 70 total documents listed here. And I just want to note that there's the advice we started to collate a few years ago. That's available in Annex 1. And thanks to the Secretariat again, especially Marianne, for compiling an executive summary, which is part of the document. Moving into our first annual agenda item, the annual reports. These are all summarized as part of Annex 4 in the report, the list of the documents which you should be able to click on to open specific summary reports from member countries. As far as the discussion, while each report is summarized in Annex 4, we did have a section in our main report that deals with the annual report discussions. There was some back and forth between Peru and specifically Chile and what goes on in their jurisdictions. There was the usual debate on stock structure hypotheses and how they fed into advice locally. Also, we had some technical discussions on squid with respect to genetics, and then also some minor comment on observer coverage from some of the member nations' fleets on squid. Okay, so the first kind of meaty agenda item is the commission guidance and what we did intersessionally. Seen here is my main assistant for most of the meeting. I was clearly paying lots of attention here, basically to conduct our assessments, provide advice based on assessments, and then look at the impact of fishing on the marine ecosystem. And as always, try to promote the cooperation in scientific research and any other scientific advice to the commission that they might need. So that's kind of our mandate, or it is Article 10 of the convention, and how the SC role in the commission. So what we're starting with here is an overall look at the main categories of study dealing with the different stocks and the work plan. Starting and just working backwards to the Jack Mackerel. This is the work plan for Jack Mackerel. You can see I've highlighted or left in boldface what we actually were able to tackle this year as part of the lighter agenda, given COVID conditions. And we also have some new information that is going to change things rather dramatically, but the list here will just show what we agreed to before the SC meeting and some of the conditions that led up to our advice. I'll be talking about the need for more information during workshops that are planned in the coming year when we talk about Jack Mackerel specifically. Okay, if we move on to the next topic, that'll be squid. Moving to the squid, this year we did not hold a workshop as we had planned. Those things have been postponed into the next year. We also have some issues related to observer coverage that were also planned to be covered, but they did not get met. As far as deep water goes, I want to just note that what you're seeing on the left-hand side here is what we have in our pre-SC meeting report, the summary of what we agreed on to tackle. And what you see on the right-hand side is the format that is part of the commission's guidance to the SC. And so I've just formatted it two different ways. So you'll see this interchangeably, but you can see from this slide that we are focusing this year or 2020 on the Orange Roughy assessment, and then lots of discussion about the deep water VME encounter rates and other aspects as seen on the next slide. As I mentioned in the previous slide, this is showing the work plan for deep water, detailing a number of activities, including spatial management, the effectiveness of CNM 03 regarding encounters with VMEs, and part of that is examining also how management measures should be applied, whether or not there should be protocols for determining review of VME taxa and the like. And also, as noted before, the relatively large document that was produced under agenda item 2.10 on bottom fishery impact assessments. Those were all the topics that were discussed here. In terms of habitat monitoring, this is moved into part of our ecosystem considerations and things that we address each year. We evaluate what's happening for pelagic fisheries, but also there's a large activity right now on habitat monitoring. And these are some of the items that are being given high priority this year. More details on that when we get to that section of the SC report coming up. And finally, for the last category of our work plan, we have the cross-cutting issues, which includes the observer program, seabird bycatch monitoring, things like marine pollution, climate change studies, and of course, data standards, which is something that we review literally every year. Moving into each of the main species categories, we had a deep water species had a very lengthy 2-day workshop. Was 18 recordings over 4 different sessions that I helped by chairing, and it was fairly endeavor. These are the specific topics that we talked about. I won't go into all of the details here, but these were specified by slot, and the recordings are available in specific aspects. You'll see that one of the main activities of this workshop was to improve on the bottom fishing impact assessment document that had been heavily revised, which I'll touch on later on as well. This is the outline of the key report, which you can access by clicking on this link, just the 23-page report for the topics. So that's all I have for the workshop that was held before the SC started. What's shown here on this slide are all of the papers that were presented to the Deepwater session agenda item for the full scientific committee. And this covers the exploratory fisheries, which I'll talk about in a few slides, but a lot of work on the orange roughy and VME taxa, as we saw in the work plan, and also a number of things related to the bottom fishing impact assessment revisions. Okay, so the first topic I would like to talk about in the Deepwater section are the orange roughy assessments. This table at the top shows the 3 assessments that were presented to the SC. Each of them have different levels of data availability, but in reviewing the assessment, these were consistent, and we provided recommendations for the maximum catch for each of these areas, at least for the near term. For the West Norfolk Ridge stock of orange roughy, the uncertainty was relatively high, and because of that, the adjustment was to take half of the median yield estimate, and that resulted in 54 tons total for this stock. So the SC appreciated the efforts and recommended that these be adopted for all 3 stocks. Also that they be updated within 2 or 3 years so that if more precaution is needed, that could be taken into account. Generally speaking, these 3 assessments indicated that exploitation rates were relatively low and that the adjustments to the stock relative to the stock status uncertainty were appropriate and sufficiently precautionary. Somewhat related to the orange roughy discussions were impacts on vulnerable marine ecosystems, i.e. VMEs. And there were a number of papers talking about VMEs and presenting the latest data and approaches towards management. And one of the issues that was raised relative to the orange roughy stock is if the quota or catch advice is increased, would that have significant impacts on VMEs? And we noted that in our report. But what I'm showing here are the results shown in Deepwater paper number 11 that was presented, and the link is available here to click on if you like. And this is just a map they produced from the database that they have in this paper or presented and turned over to the Secretariat. And it's just showing some of the open areas, not at the fine scale resolution, but kind of a coarse resolution relative to areas that are known to have VMEs that are closed to fishing. So it provides a nice glossary, which I think is important to review, especially as relates to specifications and CMMs for different for the commission that's presently being used, and if they're how they're categorizing things like move-on rules and encounters. It's important to know whether what these definitions are. Based on paper number 11 from the Deepwater Group, they came up with a list of agreements here related to VME taxa identification and development of identification guides, things like that. They also requested members and CNCPs to compile any information they hold on VME groups that can contribute to the available data for the Secretariat, and also adding questions on how the FAO criteria could best be combined to identify VME taxa in the work plan for future analysis. New Zealand presented paper number 12 for the Deepwater Group, which generated lots of discussion. They had a point-by-point recommendation for a protocol to be developed when reviewing VME encounters. After a lengthy discussion, because the CMM number 3, would be revised, then the change in how habitat suitability predictions and expectedness might change was uncertain. Consequently, we did not have any recommendations at this time from this work. Moving on to the discussion of the revisions to the bottom fishing impact assessment standard. The SC, this was an activity that we took on and reviewed in September, provided feedback and provided a list of detailed changes and added sections, and especially would like to thank all the members that participated in this activity. It was something that helped out greatly and led to a much improved final document. The SC does have two recommendations to the Commission. One is that the review of the bottom fishing CMM, the Commission may wish to consider additional precautionary measures for areas and taxes at higher risk from bottom trawl fishing, and also to address the uncertainty and provide additional confidence that the CMM will meet its objectives. They also wished to provide or request the Commission to provide guidance to the SC on the level of protection and any structure function of the VMEs it requires to assure that significant adverse impacts on VMEs are prevented. And this would be useful to show in the multi-annual work plan. Okay, so next we're going to delve into the Jack Mackerel assessment work. There's a long history of this assessment work, which I've been involved with since 2008. And here we're showing the timeline that's leading to this year's scientific committee meeting, number 9, and the expectation that we will be able to provide advice from a full benchmark with all of the revisions to the data, which I won't go into in much detail, but on the next slide I'll talk about plans for 2021. One of the activities that we did in the pre-SC meetings was to discuss that we would not delve into alternative model evaluations for Jack Mackerel, and most importantly that our catch advice would employ the currently agreed upon harvest control rule from Annex K from a few years ago. That said, we do have lots of plans for this year. In addition to the MSE work, we really need to hold a data workshop to ensure that the new age and growth relationships are well taken care of, and also that the data can be extensively backed up and made sure that everyone agrees on where they came from and that they're treated appropriately within the assessment model. We expect that data workshop will be virtual. We also are planning an important assessment benchmark where once we have the data corrected, we'll be able to apply model alternatives to lead to advice. And I did offer Seattle as a potential venue for this summer, but of course will depend on travel restrictions and the availability of people during that time. We did run a number of models, and this is fairly typical, where we take last year's accepted model exactly as was specified and incrementally add all of the new data pieces. And then the bottom line here is that we basically just updated all the model. We do this to evaluate what information is changing from one piece to another. Here is a table of the assessment data, and this just steps through that we're talking about 4 specified fleets that provide catch at age or length, landings, and abundance indices. This is the time series of Jack mackerel catch, noting that the large green component is for south central Chile, the blue is for the northern part of Chile, and this red is for the far north, while black is the offshore. The assessment model for Jack mackerel uses the catch data shown in the previous slide, but importantly tunes it to the available information. This shows historical data and updated new information. And 2 things to note is that the offshore fleet, which is primarily the EU, China, Korea, and the vessels that operate outside economic zones, have data that are somewhat below the model predictions. This is the upper left-hand corner table. In terms of other indicators that are important, the Chilean CPUE down here in this second to the right on the bottom row is showing a general increase, as are the Chilean acoustics in the north. They've had 2 years in a row with really large increases in biomass on the order of 1.5 million tons in that region. Since the 2008 original science working group meeting, jointly held with FAO in Santiago, a number of stock structure hypotheses were entertained, and the following 2 are continuing throughout all of the science working group meetings and the scientific committee meetings. Hypothesis 1 is that there is a multiple stocks with a split roughly between northern Chile and Peru. And the other hypothesis, which is entertained every year, is that there's a single stock where all 4 fleets contribute to the fishing mortality on one stock. Stepping through a summary of each of these 3 stocks, 1 under one hypothesis and 2 under the other hypothesis. This is showing the stock summary of spawning biomass, fishing mortality rate, recruitment and catches for the northern stock under the two stock hypothesis. And this is the two stock hypothesis with results showing the southern stock. I should point out that the blue lines in the top two panels are annual estimates of spawning biomass at FMSY and Y. Since the 2008 original and quite similar to the southern stock and the two stock hypothesis, this is the single stock results, which is traditionally been used for management advice. Moving on to the science advice summary, the main recommendation following our harvest control rule, which says that the increase cannot be greater than 15%, or the change in the advice cannot be greater than 15% as a mitigation measure, means that because things are looking upwards based on the available data and the current assessment model, leads to a catch recommendation at or below 782,000 tons, metric tons. It should be noted that the figure on the left here is showing the two stock hypothesis along with the single stock hypothesis, and that neither of these would change. The advice would be the same whether you adopted one hypothesis or the other. And this table is just showing the advice summary and changes in status. Again, this is for the single stock hypothesis. Just also note that there was some debate, again, on how different measures are being taken and the applicability of the two stock versus one stock. And we're looking forward to resolving that issue when it comes time to the benchmark work. In terms of recommendations, the overall recommendations was an exchange of odorless, which the chair of the working group, Dr. Martin Pasteurs, has already taken up, and hopefully members will participate in a timely fashion for that. The second recommendation was to hold a 3 or 4 day data workshop. As mentioned earlier, that's to make sure that all the new revised data are consistent and done the appropriate way across fleets, and that the historical time series can be reconstructed. The final recommendation for Jack Mackerel deals with the very important benchmark workshop, which I felt needed at least 4 days and that it needs to be held as soon as possible. Preferably, it would have happened last year, given the revisions in the growth. But we do expect some fairly large changes in the data and the application. And just to the commission, one of the reasons why we put in something like a 15% control rule maximum change is exactly for this type of data change that might have happened. It was what we would consider outside the model level uncertainty. So those are all the things that will be happening at the benchmark, including some technical aspects, which, thanks to the EU's contribution to funding the MSE activity, we should be able to upgrade our display figures and diagnostic tools, thanks to them applying it into the FLR package. Moving on to the squid assessments, that's the next agenda item here. We had 3 main discussion topics. dealing with, first one was to assist in constructing a management measure, conservation and management measure, and lots of discussion took place in small groups on developing a measure for effort control, but we weren't able to agree on that. Um, the Another aspect was technical in nature, dealing with genetic approaches, and we did develop an agreed maturity stage schedule that will be applied in the observer program. And thanks to the Secretariat being responsive to the reporting forms that were requested by the Commission, those were completed and accepted with some minor modifications. Just there were a number of highlighted statements by members and observers, and those are provided in Annex 9. And also some deal on some issues with the how to deal with tonnages and effort controls. Okay, moving on to our habitat monitoring session. This was led by, prior to the full SC, there was a workshop or sort of held by the chairs of this workshop, Mariano Rivera and Aquiles Sepulveda, and those are provided in Annex 10. There's been substantial work that's been done on that, both in terms of specifying habitat for jack mackerel, which was used as a case study, and we recommended, the SC did, that the members of this working group encourage connection with other aspects of SPRIFMO assessment and advice, namely the deep water group, to become involved so that there can be some cross collaboration in identifying factors that are important. And this request was sent to the SC heads of delegation. Another aspect of the habitat monitoring was developing a symposium proposal that was supported by last year's commission meeting. And this just draws some of the technical aspects of how habitat monitoring can be done. And we at the SC recommended that a steering committee prepare a detailed plan because it is a fairly sizable amount of funds that the commission has granted, and we just want to ensure that it is providing the most useful information for the commission as possible. On to exploratory fisheries. There were a number of aspects that were taken into account in discussions. These were mainly two potting exploratory fishery proposals and activities. Cook Islands has been underway for a couple of years. Chile has submitted one just prior to the deadline, and it was very much a draft. And I'll talk more about that in a second. And then there were two main activities under toothfish. Specific to the Cook Islands, the SC made a number of recommendations that were applied and provided. This is just the list here. I won't read them all. As far as the Chilean version of the potting exploratory fishery, they posted several revisions, both prior to the meeting, but also during SC8. And the members that contributed to helping are to be thanked. There were some general concerns overall about overlap and cumulative effect with other exploratory fisheries. And so they really need to get together and revise the proposal and ensure that the overlap is being taken into account or to avoid it completely prior to the next SC meeting. As far as the EU toothfish exploratory fishery, Revision 2 of their plan was accepted, and we approved their checklist. This is just the area for research that they were applying for, Australia and New Zealand shown here. And the green area is the SPRIFMO Convention. As far as the other proposal that involved New Zealand, EU, and Chile, They updated, it was just an update on activities, and that was covered in the intersessional meeting. And Chile noted that there were delays in their activities in 2020 due to safety and COVID issues. There were no further discussions. Finally, on to the last category, which is other matters. We discussed at length about financial issues that, thanks to Australian contributions, they be used to cover the project deficit and hopefully have some things roll forward into the next financial year so that they can be taken into account in time without losing money for the SC. We have a large set of intersessional work planned. Most of these I've already discussed, but these are the detailed list. I'll leave those here for those that are interested in getting all the details, but we have our work cut out for us in the coming year, and those activities are extremely important. Finally, with respect to the next meeting, Panama has offered. They're to be thanked. As normal at this stage of the commission meeting, we would request the next SC hosts for 2022 to start thinking and provide at least an indication whether they would be available. What's shown here are just the years and the members that have so far hosted an SC meeting, or in this case, the science working group is indicated by a tick mark. That was pre-formation or ratification of the commission. So that's one thing that's changed. Let's see, and here's some specific details of what we think might happen in terms of workshops and working groups going forward. And just these are all things that should be on the commission's slate going forward. And then finally, we have had good involvement from observers, and we noted that FAO has a number of research projects, one of which is on the COM9 observer paper number 3, and they'll be presenting on this, and that the SC agreed that the Secretariat support would be useful, and we should have clearer aims in the development of this project. And with that, I will close, showing the usual pictures of my assistants during the SC. And I will be happy to provide responses to questions during the commission meeting itself, given the 10 minutes that we've been allotted for the scientific committee meeting.